That is Liberal MP Anthony Housefather earlier on this program. In response to a question I asked him after he announced that he was reflecting on his future as a Liberal MP, you heard him there. He is not ruling out making a move to the opposition Tories after the outcome of a vote on an NDP motion earlier this week. I'm here with the front bench, Saïd Selvem, Gary Mark, Carol Bélanger, and Marika Walsh. That motion, Marika, was an interesting series of events. Essentially, the most controversial part was about recognizing the state of Palestine. The Liberals introduced last-minute amendments that watered that language down. But the vote itself and the way it all played out, with just Housefather, Ben Carr, and Marco Mendicino voting against it, has obviously really affected Anthony Housefather. It's one thing to say you're not sure if you might have to sit as an independent. It's another thing to say you might go to the Tories.
Yeah, and to say so publicly, these things. I think that's what's so stunning about how things have turned this week, that he would float publicly in a scrum with reporters. First of all, he's reflecting on his presence in the Liberal caucus and that he feels isolated and that a sort of a line was crossed on Monday. And then to tell you that there's no direct talks with Tories, that leaves a lot to the imagination. And he's a parliamentary secretary in this government. And he, I believe, only just recently got that position. But it all speaks to, while maybe the Liberals got the best of many bad options on Monday with the motion amendments and the result, it speaks to the very frayed tensions within caucus and more broadly to the confusion it has sown with Israel, which is a Canadian ally, and with many other people as to what government policy actually is now.
And the fact that it's having a political impact for them too, Carl, is I think significant, because he said he's not having direct conversations, but he has lots of friends in the Tories and he's talking to them. I mean, he very quickly could have said, or easily could have said rather, I'm not going to go to the Tories. I'm just considering whether this is the home for me.
And what you saw was a man that's really distraught. Yeah. And if I had been advising him, I would have said, don't do this interview. Yeah. Stay home, think about it, because obviously the emotions are really raw. And when you're putting these emotions out there, you say things that you may regret later. So listen, I mean, the government could have played this differently. At the end of the day, has the policy of the government really changed? I don't think so. I think you basically have the same position that they had before this vote, because they brought these amendments and they didn't want to vote against the NDP motion, so they found, for political reasons, elsewhere. Clearly, it didn't work well for Anthony Housefather and others. But frankly, it's an issue that will keep going and going as long as Israel keeps its campaign going, and the Liberal government doesn't quite know how to handle it. They're trying to walk this fine line, and when you walk this fine line, sometimes you step on one side, sometimes you step on the other side.
Well, it's interesting also because on Monday, as this was all unfolding, Cabinet was meeting multiple times, even at 6 o'clock, just before the vote was supposed to take place. The amendments came in, Gary, very late. And it seemed like they sort of thought of this as a win almost, right? We didn't have to vote in favor of the explicit language the NDP had put forward. We got our own language in there, and we can kind of breathe a sigh of relief. We crossed this one hurdle in what is a very contentious and divisive issue among caucus. But now it might have cost them an MP, which is not to their bitter enemies at the moment, or bitter opponents, I should say, at the moment, who are right now much higher than them in the polls.
Well, we shouldn't speculate as to whether Mr. Housefather will actually cross over to the Conservatives. Those kinds of decisions are made in the privacy of back rooms. And so I wouldn't speculate on him doing that. But I would say that the NDP motion did put, showed the schisms that exist within the Liberal Party, some of the difficult situations that they are placed in. And I think Mr. Housefather appears to me to be very genuine and very emotional about how he felt about this, and I'm not sure I agree with Carl that he shouldn't have talked about it. I mean, that is, that kind of authenticity is why people vote for politicians. They appreciate people who speak their minds and understand where they're coming from and what they support and don't support. So as a politician, I don't think Mr. Housefather ends up being worse off for having done so. Whether he goes to the Conservatives or serves as an independent or continues to remain with the Liberals remains to be seen. But his authenticity in his display of emotions, I think, was actually pretty impressive.
Yeah, and I think I sort of take both Carl and Gary's points. I think if I were to guess, Carl, Saïd meant more maybe don't openly muse about the possibility you might go to another party. Certainly reflect your authentic view on what's happening, and he is very genuine in how he comes across. But to say, and Gary's right, we don't know the conversations that are happening in the back rooms. But like I said earlier, you could easily put a stop to those conversations if it wasn't something you were considering, and it clearly is.
Exactly. This is something that I was surprised to see as well, as the fact that he wasn't ruling it out. Again, this is such an emotional and divisive issue, so it makes sense that, again, he's speaking his mind. He's clearly emotionally distraught by the outcome of the vote. But at the end of the day, the interesting thing is that by not ruling it out, you create a bit of a bidding war, almost, if you will. So if Mr. Housefather is truly getting offers from the Conservatives or is having conversations with them, then likely he's also having conversations with the Liberals, as he mentioned he was. And, the PMO, I imagine, is not happy about how this all went down, especially when you have Liberal ministers who have expressed support and sympathy for Mr. Housefather, especially given the emotional sort of fallout from the issue. So can the Liberals afford to lose another MP or lose an MP here? Absolutely not. But I think that he has to consider many things, as he mentioned, which includes ideological alignment, his support for the party, and the path forward as well as we go forward in the next few months.
Marika, I guess the question is also, he may be having those conversations, but whether or not the Tories actually, would invite him to join their caucus is a different story, because the interesting thing is he talked about how this has become defining for him, a defining issue. But all the other things we talk about on this panel show how far apart the two parties are on so many other issues. It's not like they're kind of both close to the middle on things. They're very, very different.
Which seemed to be what some people at the Liberal caucus on their way in were taking comfort in this morning when we were asking them about Mr. Housefather's comments yesterday about whether he still had a place in the party. They said Mr. Housefather is a Liberal. And so maybe the government is taking heart in that. I'm not sure, though, given how defining he has made this one issue, where things fall for him. I do know from discussions with MPs that it's sort of a multi-layered hurt and frustration with what happened on Monday. Both that the amendments came so last minute, they didn't have a chance to consult or discuss, and they had been doing that with their own constituents for weeks prior, or days prior, I should say, that they had no sort of role in that, no awareness of what was coming, and sort of being forced to just go with it. And also, Mr. Housefather, was quite emotional yesterday when he was talking about the standing ovation his colleagues gave Heather McPherson. She and NDP MPs had put forward this motion that had originally called for Palestinian statehood. They were wearing Palestinian symbols in the House of Commons when they voted. And so you could see when he, as somebody who describes himself as a Zionist, a Jew, and a Canadian, sees that it is emotional, and it kind of goes beyond partisan politics then at that point.
And I think for what I've garnered from what he said, Carl, is it's the idea that he seems like he used the word isolated. He doesn't feel like in that moment where they stood up, he talked about it being a line that was crossed, like he doesn't feel like they necessarily have his back. I don't think they necessarily were trying to not have his back, but he doesn't feel like they're there in the positive sense.
And usually I say that in politics you have issues that are important and issues that are useful, and the Middle East is rarely useful. But in this case, I think the NDP put their finger on something that could be useful to them, which is a divided Liberal caucus and emotions being raw and people not thinking straight and feeling isolated from each other. So a divided Liberal Party is good for the NDP. So, if I was Machiavellic, I would say this was a very cunning move by the NDP to put this. And at the same time, they were very reasonable because they accepted the amendments of the government. Of course, we want to work together to bring peace in the Middle East. And in that sense, the NDP is united today in a way that the Liberal Party is not.
Well, the NDP is united on the issue. The Conservatives are united on their position on the issue. It's the Liberals who kind of are reflecting Canadian society at the moment, which is pretty divided on the issue.